Okay, hi, I'm Nigel. I'll be going through the first part of the session. Apologies, first of all, because I've just transferred these slides into the polling software and forgot to change the date. So we've now gone back in time 6 months to November, the last time we ran this, but the slides have been updated. So you can be assured we've kind of looked at them and made that happen. So what I'm going to cover is kind of what is secondary data, some of the issues with reusing data. We're going to use between us quantitative and qualitative examples of what's available with a case study, some presentation and some demonstration. We're going to be using software called Mentimeter, which just allows us to ask questions and to see the results on the screen. We've also got a couple of activities embedded within the presentation to help you reinforce what we're saying, to practice what we're saying. So first of all, have you reused existing data before? So this is where you need to go to a website, menti.com, and put in the code at the top. I think Social put that in the chat as well. That's 9737 4404. So this is the question. You'll now be prompted to answer that. Okay, so that's great. So that looks like a reasonably even split actually between those of you who've used secondary data and those who haven't. So as Sorsha said, use the Q&A if you have questions as we go along, and we'll try and pick them up at an appropriate time in the session. Okay, so I'm going to move on to say what is secondary data. And I think if we think of quantitative data, first of all, we have a number of people who collect data, and these are all UK examples, but this is there are actors across the world who collect data. So every country nearly has a statistics agency. We have an agency called NatSem, which does a lot of social research, the British Social Attitude Survey, which we'll be looking at later on, the Housing Survey and so on, and Understanding Society, which is based in Essex and is a longitudinal study. And I think what they're doing is primary research. So they're going out, identifying people to talk to, they're collecting data for plan purposes. And a lot of these kind of surveys have lots of information that are useful for other researchers, because as you can imagine, the cost of field work and going out means that surveys aren't often used just to go and find out one thing in social research, though they may be in political research at times around polling. So what then happens is that those data collectors finalize the data and they put it into an archive like ours, the UK Data Service, where it's available for secondary research. The picture is of Hans Roslin, who did a lot of work collecting data from different countries about life expectancy over a period, and then produced a fantastic kind of graphic summary of change over time. So the data that's been collected may be used for a quite different purpose. And what are the good things about reusing data as well? Data sets. Well, I mean, realistically, the data sets that you have access to, like Understanding Society or the British Social Attitudes, would be pretty impossible for us to create as individual researchers. So it's cost effective. All of the ethical issues about data collection are dealt with, and we don't need to go through the process of recontacting data subjects. And the reused data can be used by others to make claims. So it's a broader resource for all of us. But on the downside, we don't necessarily understand some of the issues with data and data collection. So to give you an example, there's a survey due to come into the data service later this year, an ethnic minority survey, EVENS. That is quite a complex process of data and data collection. And we won't understand that in the same way as the people who designed and carried out the survey. So there's some work to do to understand the data, to think about potential ethical issues about the way you're going to use that data, and the fact that it might not be a perfect match to what you want to find out. So you'll be trading off the validity, the accuracy of being able to answer your research question against the benefits of reduced cost and larger data sets. And it's not, you can't take that study forward. So if it's your own study, you can kind of develop from it and maybe run a second wave or whatever. So in terms of researchers who are going to reuse secondary data, I would never underestimate the effort needed to understand the data and the need to be pragmatic about whether the data are good enough for your purpose. So we might always have a perfect question we would like to ask, but maybe what we've got is good enough. So let's just have a look at this section a bit. So when you have been taught or when you carried out research, you might have started off thinking this is a pretty straightforward process. I get a research question, I find some data, I look at it, I analyze it, and then I produce my report. For many of you, you'll know that the process is a lot more messy. That we often go round and around. So we might find data. In light of the data, we might have to refine the research question. Once we look at what we've got, we might need to go back to the research question or look again to see if there are other types of data that would help us. As we're analysing it, we may need to go back and evaluate, locate, rephrase research questions. So it's quite a messy process, often involving repeating steps, and at times kind of having disjunctures between different phases, because this is clearly not the only thing most of us will be doing. So first of all, I want to kind of say, how do we find data? And we've got a catalogue of data that you see when you go on the UK data service. So you can search that catalogue. You can look at theme pages. If you're interested in a particular type of data that's already been covered, you might be able to look at webinars, and there will be more videos added as we go along. So I'm just going to give a quick demonstration. No, I'll leave that. We can come to that because you'll be doing that yourself. So once you get to find the data you want, you need to understand what information was collected, from whom, and when and where, and any changes that have been made to that data before it was archived. So a lot of that information is held in the documentation. Sometimes you might find the documentation quite challenging. For example, we provide the labour force survey, and there is a project going on at the moment to rewrite the documentation for that, which is quite difficult to navigate. It's probably one of the biggest reasons for calls to our help desk. So hopefully revising that documentation, which has grown over the years of doing the labour force survey, will make it easier to see what's there. But for many of the surveys, the documentation is pretty good. You've got a clear list of what variables are there, when it was collected, the sampling methodology, and the way that data has been manipulated before it was archived. So the documentation, well, there's likely to be a user guide. You may want to go back to the original questionnaires to look at the phrasing, and you may be looking at interview schedules, and there may be other resources. So some studies will deposit data reports that they do. So for example, the British Social Attitude Survey does an annual report providing headlines from the survey, and that's available, and that's quite a useful resource, both in terms of any data set you're using, but also historically to look at maybe how things have changed over time, to pick up previous analysis as part of a literature review. So let's think about what's available. We'll do a short case study and we'll demonstrate what sorts of documentation available and think through some key issues. So first of all, this isn't a Mentimeter activity, so I'd just like you to think and maybe type in the chat the kind of data you think you might find on the UKDS website. So just give it 2 or 3 minutes and think about the data you would expect to find, focusing on quantitative data, survey type data, or census data. Okay, so we've got census data from a whole range of things there: longitudinal studies, census, labor statistics, population statistics, demographics, population, health, education, health and social care data, crime data. Okay, that's great. I mean, there is loads of stuff there. For example, I was supervising a dissertation student a couple of years ago, and she was interested in doing something on the 1981 Brixton riots. We found in the data service the poll taken by Maureen on attitudes to race in 1981 after the Brixton riots, which was quite useful as a kind of insight into the kind of questions she was going to ask. So he's added in employment stats, including salaries. So there's a real wealth of information there. A lot of people have deposited data over time. So as well as the big studies, which I think you've kind of flagged up a lot of, there are also a number of others. Business development and financial information is another area. Okay, I'm going to kind of move on from there and just say, well, what do we get? What can we get in terms of the data we're looking at? So we have cross-sectional surveys, which are of individuals, families, households, and businesses at one point in time. So these would tend to be linked to kind of research activities where the researchers deposit the data after they've collected it. So the EVEN survey that I talked about ethnic minorities was funded by the ESLC to pick up what was happening with racial groups after COVID. So it's been funded to be done. One, it's a cross-sectional survey. It will have lots of interesting things in it because of the group of people who've been asked and responded to the questions. But it's unlikely to be repeated. It's not. There's no plan to repeat it in the same form. We move on. We look at the repeated cross-section taken at different points in time, but within different samples. So the British Social Attitude Survey, the Crime Survey, the English Housing Survey are all examples of repeated cross-sectional. So each time the sampling is new. It doesn't mean that somebody might not end up in the same survey, but there's no intention to track individuals over time and no ability to between the surveys. You can't identify the individuals. The next type is longitudinal data. So this is where we're tracking individuals, families, households over time. So we're looking at asking a series of questions. Maybe those questions will vary over time and there will be different modules included. So a big example of this is Understanding Society, which is a large-scale household survey carried out every year. And there was a series of COVID boost waves as well, one every 3 months over a period. I don't remember when it ended because that's the last time I used it was last year. We also get data about about place. So examples of this are the census aggregate data, which will be coming available, we hope, from next month. So that would be tables of univariate and multivariate data covering the different geographies within the census countries. There will be different release times for the 4 countries. And also we can get flow data, which would help us look at issues like internal migration, like commuting, student residence. And we get aggregate data about countries, so from sources like the World Bank that give us an international time series. So lots of different types of analysis potentially available. So what we're going to look at is the crime survey for England and Wales. So this was formerly called the British Crime Survey. So it's a repeated cross-sectional survey. It's a source of information about crime. So it's quite different to recorded crime statistics. There's maybe a couple of things to say about recorded crime statistics. The first is that we would tend to only record crime if there was some benefit to us. So for some groups of people where there's no benefit to recording a crime, issues of violence potentially, where it's seen as a norm, theft and loss of property where insurance isn't available, etc., might lead to crimes not being reported. My local police force, Greater Manchester, has been in trouble fairly recently about the fact it hasn't then recorded that crime. So there are issues around hate crime, for example, where it hasn't been recorded for 2 years. So what this does is get at people's experience and attitudes towards crime. So it's an annual survey, around 35,000 individuals with a group of younger people. And it looks at those who've been victims of crime in the previous 12 months. So we can see how likely people are to experience crime. It also covers demographics, attitudes to the police and the criminal justice system. So this is the kind of source where we get the kind of victimhood information. So about young men being more likely to be victims of crime, about different racial groups facing different experiences of crime and different attitudes towards the police. So it's quite an important survey for criminologists. If we look at what happens with that, where that record is, this is an SPSS type format, but it looks like a spreadsheet. So we have individual anonymized records, and we have generally numbers of these have been translated into written categories, so they're easier to understand. So looking at those as sex, years in the area, whether people are working, presumably the split is what this questionnaire is about. And there are different levels of access for this data. So our standard end user license or safeguarded form is available to anybody who is registered with the UKDS. And once you've got that, you can get the standard crime survey. If you want to look at more detailed geography or some of the questions, then you need to go through a secure access process, which is covered on the website, but is basically a training so that you're accredited as a safe researcher, and then you submit a proposal to use any secure access data. So looking at how this was used is a paper by Hind Khalifa et al. It looked at violence against people with disability using the British Crime Survey 2009-10. So where there was an introduction of disability measures, and there was a special licensed version of the data. So there were 46,500 adults and 9,000 had at least one limiting disability. And what that found was disability increases the risk of experience violence, and the levels of victimization were highest amongst those with mental health problems. Because the sample was representative of the population, there was an ability to make an estimate for what was happening in the population of England and Wales. And this, I suppose, focuses the mind on hate crime against people with disabilities or because of their disabilities. I'm going to quickly go through sampling. So surveys are based on sample. So is the sample representative? So are we excluding groups of people? Are we excluding those who don't live in private addresses, those who live in some form of communal establishment? Are we excluding people who don't live within the specific geography? So if we were to do a national survey and we were to do the field work in London, that probably wouldn't be very representative of views necessarily across the country. What's the response rate like? So we might target certain populations. We might have a structured analysis of what the population should look like. But does the response rate suggest that some groups are overrepresented and some are underrepresented? Is there a bias in those who choose to answer questions and those who don't? So for those who work through these surveys and prepare them, they will always provide or generally provide a set of weights to make the data representative. So most of the national surveys are probability surveys, but increasingly we're beginning to see non-probability surveys available. So the Even survey is a non-probability survey, and there is quite a complex story that they will need to explain to users of it about how the weights have been adjusted to try and make it representative of the population. And sample size, kind of, is there enough cases to make a precise estimate? One of my main areas of interest is around race, and ethnicity is quite often challenging because particular small groups are not easy to get enough power to be able to make claims. So, for example, the vaccine hesitancy claims that were made near the beginning of the pandemic, when the vaccine was being put out, were based on a very small sample and didn't actually include those ethnic minorities who are eligible for vaccines at all, or in very small numbers. So the claims were quite dubious, really. In the data, there are citations provided, and you should use that when using data. So the first activity is on a PDF, which we will, you've been sent before, but what we want to do is to go and look at the documentation. So okay, so what we're going to do is go to the British Social Attitude Survey 2019. Now this version is an open access one. So it's actually a teaching data set that we've prepared recently to avoid issues if you're not registered properly. So you should be able to go into this this survey without having to register or sign in. We're looking at the documentation, so it isn't, but so what we'd like to do is to work through these questions, and we will have a poll afterwards. I thought there were meant to be polls for this. So which of the following topics does BSA 2019 cover? And if we look in the user guide, we can quite easily find out different aspects of what was covered. So there's a whole section on analyzing the data. So looking just at this bit, and I'm not going to go through all of the questions like this, we can see that there are issues about party affiliation. The Brexit party is included in there. Attitudes on the left-right scale. And that is, I'm apologize first of all for not having that sorted out properly for you. So it covers political party identification. I think it covers Brexit. The BSA has conducted every year? How many units did it cover? There is a specific number for those. I think we might get these later on. And what does a variable cover? So, okay, what I've done is missed out this little bit about what was asked, and then I'll come to the responses, and apologies again for my disorganization. So we use computer-aided interviewing. It makes it easier for routing respondents through the questionnaire rather than saying, if you answered this to this question, then go to there. It enables subsamples to be taken to take particular modules within a questionnaire. This is saying who's being asked this question, for example, about special working hours arrangements. And then once we've got the raw data, the responses, we might then adapt those and create derived variables from the data. So over to Maureen to talk about reusing qualitative data.
Thank you, Nigel. So I'm Maureen Haaker, and I'm going to talk about similar things as Nigel, but for qualitative data. So first, I'll go through different types of qualitative reuse projects, and then I'll walk through a case study of one of those types of reuse and do a quick overview on how to get started reusing qualitative data, including addressing a couple of key issues that arise. They are very similar to what Nigel talked about, but we'll give the qualitative slant on it. And then finally, I'm going to go through how you might find some qualitative data. Qualitative data reuse is becoming a little bit more common in recent years. The UK Data Service is certainly offering more qualitative data sets in a much more accessible way than it used to be able to do before. So previously, you might have to actually go to the archive and sift through papers and that sort of thing, whereas now a lot of it is already digitized, so you can just download it. So there's many ways you can reuse qualitative data. So you can quite simply give a description or an understanding of a particular social and historical point in time. And why this is useful is because you can see more of the data than just what the publications reveal. So you might not be able to see all of the data depending on what's available in the archive, but you can certainly see more of the data than what was originally published. That way you won't be limited to just what researchers thought was salient for their research questions and topics. You can actually explore it a little bit further and see what might be of interest to your questions and the setup for your particular project. Another way to reuse data is to consider analyzing the methods that are used and look for lessons that might be gleaned about the most effective ways of sampling and data collection methods or developing topic guides. And one thing that is especially valuable is to look at, how an interview, for example, was laid out before the interview was conducted, and then look at what sorts of questions the interviewers thought they were going to ask. And then look at what was actually talked about in the interviews themselves and which directions the interviewer took it in. There can be many reasons why certain questions are asked or not asked in interviews, and some interview schedules are designed to be much more flexible, or sometimes tangents come up and you just want to interrogate that further. But in any case, it's a really important researcher skill to have that intuition to know what to do. And you can't really see that sort of thing unless you start comparing interview schedules with actual interview transcripts. So you can look at sort of methodological advancement, advancing your own skills, or a sort of methodological project in that kind of way. Another reuse is called reanalysis, which looks at a wide range of approaches you can take in the analysis of a data set. it usually means asking some kind of different research question than what the original researchers were trying to do. So, for example, Clive Seal and Charteris Black did a study looking at comparative keyword analysis of illness narratives. Now, the original illness narratives had been looked at exclusively for health research. But when Seal and Charteris Black came along to do the comparative keyword analysis, they were actually much more interested in analysis of the discussions rather than the actual health issues that came up in the interviews. So the question can be very different in that sort of way. Or sometimes the question can be on a similar topic to the original research, possibly even use the same kind of analysis strategy, but have a slightly different focus. So for example, Joanna Bornat looked at gerontology as a topic and found two very different data sets that were looking at it. But Bornat's research was much more focused on racism. And it wasn't necessarily the focus of the original work that she was reusing, but the data sets were rich enough to allow her to explore that theme within the existing data. And the final type of reuse, which is exemplified by a case study that I'm going to go through with you, is a restudy. And this is where you replicate the methods of a study for purposes of comparison. So you might be looking at doing a historical comparison, which could help you demonstrate how society has changed over time. Or you can do a geographical comparison, a social class, or comparison by any other variable, just to show what the differences are between those subgroups. So on the next slide, thank you, we've got this example of a reuse project titled School Leavers Study. So the original study was conducted by Ray Paul in the late 70s as part of a much wider community study on the Isle of Sheppey. And the UK Data Service holds a number of collections related to that community study. But the School Leavers Study specifically looked at student aspirations. So basically, while Ray Paul was doing his community study, he kind of happened upon teachers who set a particular kind of essay just before students were due to leave school that prompted them to imagine that they were reaching the end of their life and something made them think back to the time that they left school. And they were then assigned to write a short essay of what happened in their life over the next 30 to 40 years. Paul was particularly interested in this, so he included all of that as those essays as data in his study. So in 2009, Graham Crowe and Don Lyon, and that's Graham Crowe on the left there, standing with Ray Paul on the right, who's holding his book that he had published out of his work on the Isle of Sheppey. But Graham Crowe and Don Lyon decided that they wanted to reanalyze that data set and focus solely on student aspirations. So using the very same methodology, they conducted a restudy on school leavers for students on the Isle of Sheppey in 2009. And on the next slide, we've got the prompt that was supplied to students. So if we can just flip through to the next one, there we go, during the 2010 data collection. And it was nearly the same as the original. So there were a few shortcomings that Graham Crowe has kind of specifically addressed in some of the publications, which is that Ray Paul sort of happened upon the essay that had already been set. So there was less control over how it was pitched to students. But in talking to Ray Paul, and they tried to come up with an essay prompt that was very similar to what had been given to students in the 70s. And basically, the prompt was, imagine that you're at the end of your life and reflect back on what you've done since leaving school. They then transcribed those essays and compared the themes of the first set of essays from the 1970s to the essays that they had collected. So on the previous side was sort of a prompt with a small snippet of one of those essays. So all of those were digitized. And here's just a few more details on what they received back. So slightly different gender divide, but fairly similar amount of data received. Both data sets covered the same general themes of health, education, career, family, and leisure, but they covered it in very different ways. So in 1978, students expected much more grounded and arguably mundane sorts of jobs, career progression was gradual, followed on from very hard work. And sometimes there were talks of periods of unemployment or even quite morbidly their own early death or the early death of someone they loved. And you can see examples in the left column of some of the quotations from those essays, such as the one at the bottom. I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again, I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory. 2010, however, showed that students were imagining well-paid, quite instantaneous jobs filled with choice, but also some uncertainty. Crow and his research team also noted a clear influence of celebrity culture in those essays. So for example, you have the quote at the bottom of a girl who writes, "In my future, I want to become either a dance teacher, hairdresser, or professional show jumper, horse rider. If I do become a dancer, my dream would be to dance for Beyonce or someone really famous." The impact of the study spans beyond just the interesting changes they noted in young people's aspirations. The study was part of a much bigger community project on the past, present, and future of the Isle of Sheppey. So the goal was to engage the community alongside the research and find innovative ways of including participants in the research outputs. As part of that initiative, they published the Living and Working on Sheppey website, which has videos and artwork that's produced by the current residents of the Isle of Sheppey, as well as ways for those who participate in the research in the 1970s to stay in touch with each other and read about the history of their community. And they also helped to create a sort of shared history and memory of what living on the Isle of Sheppey means to that community. So hopefully you are now thinking about the different types of projects you might do with qualitative data. But how might you go about actually finding the right kind of qualitative data for your ideas? So in terms of searching for data, qualitative data poses a bit of a challenge. So interview transcripts, essays, other types of qualitative data often hold far more information than just what the abstract might say on the catalog page. So you might be missing out on a whole range of collections that could potentially touch on the topics that you're interested in, simply because no one has the time to sit through and read all of the data for every collection to double check that, you know, the keywords that you're interested in don't appear somewhere in there. So we do have a tool at the UK Data Service which can help with this, and it's called QualiBank. Like the data catalog, you simply type in the keyword, but instead of searching through the abstracts in the catalog pages, like the data catalog would, QualiBank actually searches through the data itself. So when you click the search button on the data catalog, you'll see a link to QualiBank sort of appear underneath that search button, or you can just also type in ukdataservice.ac.uk/QualiBank. With this tool, you might be able to identify relevant interviews that might be spread across different collections, or a collection where you didn't think that theme might come up, but actually it's there nonetheless. So in this example, I've typed in typhoid, and you can see that it's searched through and highlighted in the data itself where the word typhoid is actually mentioned. Most of these are transcripts. So the first couple of hits were actually the Morale and Home Intelligence Reports collection. So this is a historical collection from World War II. But further down, there's also examples from some of the Edwardians interviews. So the Edwardians is an oral history project that contains 453 oral histories on growing up in the Edwardian period. So when you click on one of those search results in QualiBank, you get the actual interview that would come up, and it brings you straight to the interview, to the spot in the data where that keyword is mentioned. So if you scroll to the back of the top of the page, which is what this image is showing, you can also see that there's links to external resources, collection documentation. And if you were to click on that, it would bring you to the bottom of the page, which on the next slide shows it could have things like audio extracts of the transcripts, images related to that interview. Sometimes there's also web resources. Finally, there's one last feature of QualiBank. If you want to cite directly from the interview transcript, you can do so by clicking the Create Citation button. which you would see in the left-hand menu, highlight the portion that you're interested in, and that Create Citation button turns into a Retrieve Citation button, which you can then click and you get a pop-up just like this one. So you can literally just copy and paste that citation into your document. It also has a persistent identifier. That's the URL that you see at the end of the citation. And that would bring your readers directly to the exact paragraph that you're looking at within QualiBank. So this basically is a way of introducing a transparency into your work. Also helps you to accurately cite the data that you're reusing, and also offers a way of recontextualizing some of that qualitative data, which is, of course, a really important part of doing qualitative research, is getting some of that additional context in. So we've covered different types of reuse projects that you can do, how to find and access the data, but what about the process of actually analyzing the data? And the first thing that you would need to do is to orient yourself to the original research project. So I won't reiterate everything about documentation here, but I think the main point is, don't underestimate the amount of time it might take to get acquainted with the data set. So there might be multiple levels of context to get through in order to really understand what the data is, what the limitations and opportunities are in that data. And what I mean by that is you might have more than just the data itself collected at the time of the interview or whatever the data collection method is, but you might also need to consider the metadata of the participants, the historical time period in which the data was collected, or where that data was collected. So really, the idea is that you need to understand the data set as a whole in order to get at the root of what the data can convey. The documentation provided with the data set is a really useful starting point for that. It often contains more information about the methodology, such as the interview schedule, call for participants, or sometimes there's segments that arose from some of the publications that were written by the original PI, or perhaps there's funding applications in there. There's all sorts. I've also seen some studies which have sections written up by the principal investigator about particular features of the data set, such as the sample. So for example, Annette Lawson conducted a study in the 1980s on adultery, and given the sensitivity of the topic and this, sampling became a primary focus for her. So she ended up writing a 56-page document just defending her sample. So in my time working with qualitative data sets at the UK Data Service, I've also seen background contextual material that was taken from the area of research, such as meeting minutes, government pamphlets, letters from participants. All of this kind of helps to paint a picture of what was going on around the study, and all would be included, hopefully, in that documentation. You might also need to consider the sample. So if we could just go back for a second. Sorry. You might also need to consider the sample. So for example, if the data set is too large, you might need to take a subsample. That's probably not as much of an issue with qualitative research, since they're usually smaller studies anyways. But some of the collections which got a large amount of funding, you'll need to carefully consider what is feasible. So for example, the Edwardians collection that I mentioned before, that one was put together by Paul Thompson, and it is widely considered to be the first oral history of Britain, and contains 453 80+ page interviews, life history interviews. So that would take a considerable amount of time to read and reread for purposes of analysis. So you may need to take a sample of that kind of size collection. Conversely, you might find that interviews from different data sets complement each other and would make a new, slightly larger data set that's useful to you if you combined them. Finally, you'll need to think through how you'll approach the data. So you might use an inductive strategy where you start with the data and see what comes from that, or a deductive strategy where you have a firmer idea about what it is that you're looking for within the data. Both are equally valid, but you'll need to consider your approach as you get started. So this is quite a brief overview of the couple of issues when getting started with qualitative data reuse. So if you're looking for more guidance or discussion on these issues, then there's two sources that I highly recommend. Both of them are pictured on here on this slide. So First and foremost is the Sage Handbook of Qualitative Secondary Analysis, and it just came out about a year ago or a year and a half ago. It's edited by Karen Hughes and Anna Terrence, and it's basically a comprehensive guide to some of the issues that I've already mentioned, particularly around recontextualization and sampling. There's also a short single chapter out of Silverman's most recent edition of Qualitative Research. Libby Bishop, who works at the GISIS German archive, wrote this chapter specifically on reusing qualitative data, and it's filled with further examples of reuse, and it addresses some of those key issues in a little bit more depth. If you do have access to the book through the library, I definitely recommend starting with that chapter. There's also some Timescapes Methods Guide series. So Timescapes is a archive which holds longitudinal data, and they have a sort of working paper series. So there's one on there, guide number 19. It's short, it's just a few pages. It's from Sarah Irwin and Mandy Winterton, but it's another great guide just to help you get started. All right. There are some other resources available through our website. So if you explore the Learning Hub tab, which is at the top of our web pages, you'll see there's information for new to using data, as well as pages that are specific to types of data, such as survey data and qualitative data. And that is it for qualitative data.
Okay, I think we're just about at the end there. So thanks very much for me.
Bye, thank you.